Excited so many people have been able to join us today for our webinar as we start to talk about our latest research looking at the industry. And this year, instead of doing a survey of folks working in the industry, we decided we wanted to dig in a little bit on some consumer perspectives around digital and technology. And maybe that's a good place to start out. Just sort of talking through how did we end up with the survey that we ended up with here? Um, we have been watching a couple of trends over the last few years, and as those trends have been moving and evolving and shifting, we wanted to take the temperature in a few different areas, and we weren't going to be able to do that by asking people in the industry. We really needed to get a perspective from consumers themselves. The first trend that we were looking at is consumerism. Obviously that's been one that a lot of entities in and around healthcare have been pushing. We want consumers to get more engaged in their care, get more hands-on, act more like consumers, make intelligent, engaged, informed choices, and it's working. Consumers have been taking those steps. They've gotten more involved. They have opinions, and they're actually very much making their choices based on those opinions. And we've seen that moving a lot. That's the first of those trends. The second is really technology, but more particularly the way that consumers expectations about technology are growing, how in particular they want to be engaging with brands and healthcare brands using those technologies. And then the third is patient loyalty. And I think maybe over the years we've overestimated just how loyal patients have been to individual providers or to health systems. There's been certainly a lot of focus on moments when people are actually making decisions about where to seek care and things like that. But I think there's been sort of an unwritten thing underneath that that says, hey, if we can bring them in at the right moment, they're sort of ours for the duration. And I think that's been overestimating that for quite a while. I think that idea of patient loyalty has maybe been on the decline even before the pandemic. But then as the pandemic hit within that environment, what we've seen is what we've seen in a lot of places, right? Those meta trends that were going on, things that were gradually creeping along over the course of a 2 or 3 year period there took a leap that was probably 5 to 10 years of actual forward progress. And I think that's happened with loyalty as well. So we wanted to really understand how that's impacting the way consumers are making decisions and how the loyalty question is looking from their perspective here as well. And really looking at that in terms of what that means for increased competition over every healthcare dollar out there. So we put those things together, we see that the competitive battleground for healthcare services, for healthcare organizations has been shifting, is shifting, right? It's increasingly around the experience. We're increasingly competing around convenience. We're increasingly competing around our ability to bring solutions to consumers that are grounded in technology, grounded in connectivity. And I think that the term du jour for that right now is digital front door. Some organizations have kind of grabbed it and taken their own brand. But if you attend healthcare conferences, you're hearing a lot about these kinds of initiatives that are underway from a provider side, from a solution provider side. There's a lot of interest, a lot of activity going on in this space, and we wanted to understand the health consumer perspective and all that. We want to look at the range of technologies that are coming to play. We want to see how consumers want to engage with the healthcare system using those technologies, those different channels. We want to understand better how they're making the care choices that they're making today. And we want to see how they're viewing some of those new competitors entering the market as well. So we put a survey together around that. We ended up with 601 responses that ended up in the final data set. And we'll certainly be talking about how things look across that entire spectrum of consumers. But we did include a couple of questions there to try to break out some distinct segments. We know that not every group of consumers has the same preferences or acts the same way. We wanted some sense of how some of those things differ within the area that we were looking at here. And there were really two groups where we saw some really meaningful differences in behavior across many of the questions we asked. One was age. And again, I think not terribly surprising to people. The second one was technology adoption. And kind of the propensity for technology adoption. So we look there at, are you an early tech adopter? Are you someone who needs the newest phone, the newest gadget, the newest whatever? Are you a late technology adopter? Or if you're somewhere in the middle, are you kind of on the earlier side or the later side of that? Now, interestingly, in our discussions as we got into analyzing the data, we had some people within our group who kind of said, "Hey, like I sort of think of this as the same, right? I tend to think of young people being our early tech adopters, and older people being later tech adopters, and there's certainly some correlation there. But I think it's important for us to keep in mind that they're not the same thing. That we do have some seniors who need the newest shiny object. We certainly have some young people who are much more conservative about how they adopt new technologies, or what they're grabbing onto and moving forward. But there is a correlation there. And so we put the age bands in here. You can kind of visually see that the number of really young people is much more prominent in our early adopter groups than in our late adopter groups. Our seniors tend to be a little bit more present in some of the later adopter groups than the earlier adopter groups. But you also see that there's representation from all those groups in all of these categories. We also, again, just as another way to kind of look at the data, did sort of an average age for each one of these groups. I wouldn't put too much weight into that, just because we do have some overrepresentation, particularly in our 25 to 44 group. They're right around half of the respondents to the survey overall. So again, wouldn't put too much into that, but you do definitely see that our early adopter groups tend to be younger. Our later technology or later adopter groups tend to be a little bit older. Early, younger, late, older. Anyway, you can see kind of how that plays out there, just for illustration purposes only. All right, so with that in mind, let's dive into the data. And we started by framing this around a fairly generic healthcare journey. We wanted to see if we kind of mapped out this journey, where are the places that consumers want to engage with us? And this is the journey that we put together for that. So starts at the beginning with a lot of research activities, right? Researching health issues, self-diagnosis, looking at different care options out there, maybe things like wait times, actually going through a provider selection process. And then we start to transition into kind of the more uh, uh, activities of scheduling and things like that. So appointment scheduling, maybe looking at out-of-pocket costs and figuring out what those things are going to look like, the pre-appointment paperwork, getting reminders about an appointment, and then actually holding the appointment, and then all the things that happen after the appointment. So we, a couple, again, representative items, lab results, paying the bill, and asking questions of the doctor or their staff in between the visits that might happen out there. So we took this journey and we took a number of different digital communication channels, mostly digital, and kind of said, okay, what are your preferred channels at each one of these stages of the process? And I wanted to start out here with website. And so the website was the area that had the strongest interest sort of across the board. It wasn't necessarily the strongest for every individual dot out there, but as you'll see as we pull some other data in here, very, very strong interest in using the web kind of across the board here. When we look to the left, those early, parts of the funnel, the researching and self-diagnosis and things like that, people are overwhelmingly doing this online. They're overwhelmingly going to the web for these kinds of activities. And then as they go along, there's still strong interest, although certainly less strong than in some of those early activities. I'm going to leave the website up as kind of our baseline, so as we pull other lines of data in here, we at least have something consistent to compare against. And so the first one we'll compare against here is phone, right? Because we kind of think of when we can't finish something through the website, very often the next alternative is someone picking up the phone to actually do that activity. And again, maybe not surprising, but those researchy tasks at the beginning are things that don't fit well with the phone. Appointment scheduling is maybe the one where we have the strongest interest in using the phone as a channel. It in fact sneaks just a little bit over the web for appointment scheduling. But there's some other scenarios where it's very competitive as well. Asking questions between visits between appointments. It was very, very high there, although not quite as high as appointment scheduling. And there are a couple others where the gaps between these two channels were pretty small, or actually holding the appointment, right? The telehealth versus doing an appointment by phone, pretty close there. Appointment reminders, while it was a little low, was fairly close to the web as well. So, throughout this, we were really looking at, at each stage of the journey, what is the best tactic? What is the best channel for us to be looking at and using here? And we've seen a lot more interest in messaging and text messaging from health systems. And once the technology is there, there's always the question, what can we do? What can we use it for? And appointment reminders is sort of the killer app on this one. This is the one where overwhelmingly this was people's preference in a world where kind of using the web for that is not the best option. And we didn't see as much excitement for something like phone. Text messaging was great here. The other one that jumped out to us a little bit, and again, the gap is pretty small more than anything else, is asking questions between appointments. People, certainly like the ability to pick up the phone and call their doctor's office. Texting, though, is pretty close there in terms of the channels that people are interested in using for that purpose. We also looked at mobile apps, right? It seems like there's a lot of interest in, we need an app or we have an app, how do we build out the app? What are the places we should be using an app? And I want to be clear, like, apps absolutely have a place. I think they can be a great part of the mix. I think some people have perceived me as being a little bit anti-app before, and I'm not anti-app. However, I do feel really strongly that you need to align all of these channels, all these technologies with the right problems. And that's true for apps as well. I do see organizations that get a little bit enamored with the idea of having an app, and whether they're fixing a problem that's best fixed by an app or not is sort of secondary to getting something and getting it out into the marketplace. But there are clearly some areas where the app, I think, is something that consumers really want to do, right? If you're looking kind of early in the process, early in the journey, some of those researching and self-diagnoses things, as you see here, it's going to be a pretty niche audience that's going to be going for that. Lower interest there, and again, relative to just grabbing a browser and starting to search, it's a really wide gap going on there. The strength of apps comes as we get further through the process, when we're doing some things that are more complicated, like appointment scheduling, and then particularly once we're actually getting to appointment reminders and having the appointment and getting lab results and paying the bill and some things like that, it really starts to show stronger preference, or at least very similar kind of preference to what we're seeing from the web. And I think that makes a lot of sense when you take a step back and you look at it, right? This is sort of the points where consumers are taking off that consumer hat and putting on the patient hat, right? There's a relationship, there's a commitment there. And for an app where you need to jump through some hoops, right? You need to go find an app. Maybe you need to even know that an app exists to begin with. You need to download it. It takes space. You need to open it. There's usually some kind of an onboarding process involved in it, right? Like, that's a commitment from the consumer. And it makes sense if there's a commitment to that relationship there, if they're moving to a place where they know there's going to be some back and forth and some more engagement and involvement. So those are the places where people, put it higher on their list of ways that they'd like to be doing some of those things. They're not going to go out and download that app and go through that process for every care provider that might exist in the market. And so there are places where it makes a lot of sense, and some places where it doesn't. And I don't know that I've mentioned this yet. There is more data in the actual report. So we're kind of taking a slice off this as we talk through things today. But I encourage people to download the report as well, because there is quite a bit more data in the full report. Okay, so as we look at the journey here, what does this mean? And I think the biggest takeaway for me is use the right channel for the job. Meet consumers where they want to be. Don't try to force them down pathways and tunnels that they just don't want to engage in, because by and large they won't unless they absolutely have to. And if you force them to, we're not sure how they'll feel about that experience either. So use the channel that matches up with the way consumers want to engage. Um, as much as possible, it seems like the web is a place to support the entire journey as a baseline and then support other parts of the journey as makes sense for the channels that they are. In particular, those early tasks are things that the internet at large is going to be really strong for. And we're going to dig into that here more in just a minute. Look at each of these channels as the place where consumers want to be engaging with them, right? So apps for more patient activities, messaging for reminders, and so forth. All right, so we took a number of points of that journey and we dug in deeper. And we're starting at the beginning part of that funnel with researching health information. So we certainly saw consumers having an interest in researching health condition across a wide range of channels. And while there are a lot of channels that ultimately get used, the search engines have really dominated this, right? So we saw 94% were somewhat or very likely to use a search engine here, and that 61% were very likely. The remainder of that 94% were somewhat likely. So not a surprise. Maybe we even think about consumers just starting there, but what the next step is where all of these other options often come into play. So I've got at the top there that search engine response. So that's the 94% in the blue and green bars. And that, a couple of percent on the left there being the not likely piece of that. From that search engine, which we'll kind of use again as our kind of benchmark as we go through this, the next couple options here were general health sites, so the WebMDs or National Library of Medicine sites of the world, right? They've got really good coverage across a wide range of topics. And then following that are really deep wells of content in specific areas. So diabetes.org, cancer.org, right? There's individual sites or a handful of sites out there that really kind of own that deep well of content for many of these places. So where do our local healthcare systems kind of fit into this? Well, if we keep those other lines up there and add in that local health system, you can see it's still pretty strong. The interest there is pretty strong, but it's certainly some steps down from search engines overall or some of these other general health sites or condition-specific sites out there. Right, we've got about a third of consumers that are very likely, as opposed to more than 60% of consumers that are starting at a search engine. We have not quite 3/4 who are likely or very likely to engage with that local health system website at some point in the journey. So it's not a small piece of the puzzle, but certainly they're going to a lot of these other places first and foremost. And then we need to kind of cover the gap for some things that maybe are more applicable locally, because we don't need to replace what's happening on some of these other sites necessarily. Now, at the bottom of the list, at least of the things that we asked about, were kind of voice assistants, right? The Siris and Alexas and asking them questions. I do want to be really clear, though, that even though we had almost half of people say that they're really not likely to use these things, that left the other half of respondents saying, yeah, I might use that. And so it's certainly part of the mix, and we don't want to completely disregard it, but we do want to get our house in order in some of those other areas before we start investing a lot of resources into trying to get results that would appear in some of these more downstream options. So we took those scores, we scored these things out, and that let us kind of split the audience in some different ways, right? It's hard to do certain charts and when you include too many dimensions in there at the same time. So this was kind of the range of different channels that we asked about here, and we broke this out. So we have here some of the early and late tech adopter lines. We have some of the age lines in here as well. So when we looked at the behaviors here, younger consumers and even more so early tech adopters were just more likely to use a wide range of channels. They were more excited about using all these channels kind of across the board. The seniors, the late adopters, much lower on the list, again, kind of across the board here. But it's important to keep in mind they pretty much all start at that search engine, right? The search engine was sort of the dominant item across the board. Young consumers do show a little bit of bias towards that local health system source information over some of the more general purpose health information sites. Um, and then as we get into some of the more newfangled options, mobile apps and social media and your voice search kinds of things, that's the place where the later tech adopters and maybe your seniors are losing interest pretty quickly. But those early tech adopters are actually still pretty interested in a lot of those things, maybe a little bit less so for social media and voice search, but certainly mobile apps, they're still pretty interested much further into that overall funnel. So what does this mean to all of us? Well, when you're trying to sort out your content strategy for health information, I think it's really important to note that it's not necessary to try to compete with the WebMDs of the world, right? There are sites out there, they're general health encyclopedias. You do not need to do that. You don't need to define every possible condition under the sun. Like that's a thing that exists out there, and consumers are more likely to go to those places for that kind of high level general information. Likewise, unless you're either a really focused institution or you've got a particular strategy focusing on trying to become a regional or national draw for specific things, you probably don't need to go down the pathway of creating an incredibly deep well of content around an individual condition either. Again, it's going to be really, really tough to compete with the diabetes.org type sites for those kinds of diseases. And so, understand that like if you're going to go that way, you have to have a really strong strategy in order for it to be effective. Dabbling in something like that is probably not going to provide you much benefit for the investment you're making there. I think what is worthwhile is to think about these content strategies and how you optimize to engage local people, how you optimize to engage for localized SEO, right? And so, developing unique content, telling stories about what's available locally, answering questions where the search engines could be prioritizing local answers, and also using that content in ways that maybe bypass uh, searching, pushing things out to people where they may not be actively looking for those things until something's being put in front of them. Email newsletters, some of those kinds of strategies, I think can drive a lot of value here. Trying to go head to head with WebMD is going to be a tough one, though. All right, so that leads us a little further down this journey and thinking about how consumers select different care options, right? How do consumers select care, right? And it was really interesting the way that things clustered up in terms of the responses here. And we asked about the relative importance of different factors last time they selected a care provider. I mean, a couple items at the beginning that I think of as the must-haves, right? So if the provider doesn't take my insurance, if they don't have appointments available, if they're not taking new patients, things like that, I'm probably not considering them at all, right? Very few things will make me go to a provider that doesn't take my insurance, at least knowingly, right? That makes sense. I think that's most of us kind of understand that. Interestingly, the second tier of items that popped up were all related to price, quality, expertise, things like that, right? So pricing and cost transparency, I think it's hard for me to imagine that those factors would have been such a big deal a couple years ago. But consumers have really keyed into pricing and what their out of pockets are going to be and things like that during this process. And they want quality, although I think sometimes they have a hard time assessing what that means. However, from the health system side, the availability of some of this data, right, particularly the kind of consumer meaningful pricing out of pocket kinds of information, is still a major challenge for most health systems. Now, it did surprise me quite a bit that provider ratings and reviews didn't cluster with these two. It seems in my mind like I associate those things together. It actually fell a bit further down the list. And so just keep a pin in the idea that it wasn't here, and we'll revisit as we get to it here in a minute. Because following this was not that information. Following that was all the convenience factors, right? Location, hours, the ability to schedule, the ease of searching for options, right? All of those care items came next. So again, we've got kind of those filter criteria, like, can I get an appointment and do you take my insurance? We've got, what is the cost and quality kinds of question. And then we have all the convenience factors clustered together right behind that. And that is most interesting when we see that those things all beat out an existing relationship with the care provider. And they beat out ratings and reviews from other health consumers, which again, I think kind of boggles the mind. I think we see those things very linked from inside the walls. But at least when asked, consumers indicated that was maybe a little different thing to them in their mind. But I think that existing relationship with the care provider was maybe one of the biggest surprises out of this whole survey. And again, loyalty, and we'll be digging into loyalty more as we continue to discuss the results. But the idea that, sure, I might change providers because they don't take my insurance anymore, but I might be willing, to take a little bit of inconvenience in order to see my doctor. I might be willing to work with less flexible hours to see my care provider. I think today, at least the data that we got from people today, they're saying, hey, I will take convenient location and convenient hours for me over trying to see my PCP that I have a relationship with out there. And I think that is a different mental framing than I think we would have seen a couple years ago. So we scored these out as well, and again, just a way to visualize some of this data. And as we look at this for some of the different segments that we're talking about, first and foremost, the late tech adopters came out a little bit lower on all of this. And again, that may make sense because they're not as excited about doing some of these things out there in general. They may be not as into using some of these tools to evaluate options and to pick. Interesting though, there were some things where those laggards kind of took a step up later in the funnel overall, right? Looking at ratings and reviews, it was actually pretty high on their list, and some things like that. All of our other groupings really started pretty close together, right? There's a pretty high degree of consistency in, taking insurance and availability and the importance of price and convenience. And it's really just when we get to like things like the ability to schedule appointments online that we see a greater variability start to sneak into the answer set, right? And so this is the place where we start to see some deviation. Interestingly, that existing relationship with the care provider, we have some rebound from our seniors. We have some rebound from the late tech adopters here. In fact, the seniors were the ones most likely to value the existing relationship with the care provider here. So again, for some of our audiences, it's still really high on that list, but overall, it falls below those other criteria. And then we kind of look to the right and we start to see the bigger gaps, right? Certainly we see a bigger gap in the ability to schedule appointments online, but the availability of telehealth appointments, and some of those things more to the right? Doctor videos, doctor photos, things like that, things that we do to really, often to market our docs or to sell our docs in this process, did fall farther down the list. But I take that with a little bit of grain of salt, right? So, first and foremost, and I didn't put this on here, but if you have the ability to, really impact those things that are on the left side of the priority list there, right? If you can make the product better, right, do that, right? If you can create more open hours and more flexible hours, greater availability of appointments, better locations, those kinds of things, like, do that, because that is absolutely what puts things in or out of the decision set or the comparison set for these consumers. a lot of what we've got here is really, I think, shifting what am I actually even going to be putting into the set of options that I'm comparing, right? And so, the convenience factors I think are increasingly being thought of as a filter, right? If it's not easy for me to get to, if I have to take off work to go there, if I don't have a telehealth option, things like that, I'm just not going to consider them for this at all. And then once we get to the point where, these are the handful of doctors that fit into that criteria, that's the place where the ratings and reviews, the understanding the doctors, seeing them talk about things in a video, those kinds of things are where the sort of ultimate competition kind of happens. But if they're not in that selection set at all, they're not in that selection set at all. I do think it's important, though, even though we often don't have the ability to impact office locations or office hours or availability, things like that. It's really important that we're getting that data right when we're presenting providers to consumers. And the better we're able to give consumers ways to search for providers using those things that are really important to them, the better off we're going to be, right? And this is a place where I do see a lot of health systems struggle, right? Having accurate insurance accepted information, making sure that you've got office hours kind of across the board and it's presented in a way that people can really see. Expressing whether appointments are available or if people are taking new patients, things like that. If you're not getting that data right, or if you're not presenting that data at all in some cases, that is going to put you a little bit behind the curve in terms of competing, given that so much weight from the consumer is being placed on those kinds of decision criteria. So from there, we start thinking about how and when consumers make changes of providers, right? And again, we're digging deeper into this question of loyalty here. Now, I've been watching loyalty and kind of, the different research going on in the space for a while. There's no one accepted way to look at the loyalty question. The way we ended up digging into this was we looked at consumers who received care from new providers or new health systems over the past couple of years. So we wanted to understand how much of that's going on, and we wanted to understand why it's happening. What we found is kind of across the board, 43% of consumers received care from a new provider or health system during that window. Now, not all of that is really a reflection on loyalty, right? Some access to different care providers is normal for a lot of reasons, but a lot of it is kind of a reflection on loyalty. In addition to that, even though 43% feels pretty high, within certain groups, I think the highest group was early adopters. It was higher than that. For early adopters, more than half of them received care from a new provider or healthcare system in the last 2 years. So it is a lot of consumers who are splitting care or seeing different providers over that time. So we asked in an open-ended way, why did you change providers? And so there were a lot of themes that popped up. The two that were most prominent were these. So the first one is that their healthcare needs were changing, and this is one where I'd say it's probably not a big reflection on loyalty, right? This can be new diagnosis, this could be an injury, this can be a disease, this can be new referrals from their doctor. So right, there's lots of reasons why your current care team might not be appropriate for whatever you're facing next. And so going to see a specialist or something along those lines makes a lot of sense. But the other one, which was just as large, certainly did, I think, reflect on some of the loyalty challenges we're seeing right now. And that one, was really kind of a general desire for something better, something different, something new. Now, occasionally the references we categorized here were pretty specific, right? I went to a different doctor because my doctor wouldn't give me pain meds. And that might be a perfectly appropriate reason for the doctor to say, I don't want to see you as my patient anymore. But no matter what that is, that was a reason why some people changed. Most of the things that ended up in that category, though, were much more amorphous, right? A desire for something better. They wanted better service. They wanted better options. They felt like it was time to try something new. So often it's not something specific. It's not an I went to my doctor and I got the wrong diagnosis, so I'm changing, right? It's just sort of a I am not feeling so great about this relationship that I want to keep engaging with this provider. It's time for me to start looking for something different. Maybe I'll find something that I like better, or at the very least, it's not that important to me that I continue to see the same person because I'm just not, that relationship isn't that important to me. That experience wasn't that great. We had a lot of other themes that emerged in some pretty significant numbers as well, right? And again, some of these are not necessarily reflections of a real loyalty challenge that is easily fixed, right? You have people move, and so the office they went to is no longer an appropriate place for them to receive care, right? Or in some cases, their doctor's office moved, and that was a reason that they sought a new care provider, right? We saw a number of references to insurance, right? My insurance changed. They no longer take my insurance, those kinds of things. There were a surprising number of references to price and cost. And again, many of these were pretty short answers. We didn't get, a lengthy diatribe on, what the nature of that was. But it's clear that consumers are more often than they were looking at the price equation or their out-of-pocket costs as part of the decision-making process. And I think it was pretty rare that that was the case before. And I think it's difficult for a lot of healthcare systems to compete in that place where the alternative is some much more focused, structured, urgent care or something that, Walmart's doing for primary care or something like that, where there's an actual price list, but the range of services they're really offering is much more restricted than when someone steps into a PCP's office traditionally. Um, a surprising number of consumers had doctors who just were no longer doctors anymore, right? They moved away, they retired, they died. Several references to their doctor passing away, or that they left medical practice. They decided they weren't going to be a doctor anymore. And obviously, there's some of that going on in any given year, but it seemed like a huge number relative to what we were expecting to kind of fall into that category. We had a lot of doctors who just stepped away, in one way, shape, or form. And so that was clearly a factor here as well. There was also some desire for greater convenience, and we did include things like seeking telehealth options and those kinds of things in the greater convenience category. So what do we do with that information? And I think the mind shift that I think has to happen here is patient acquisition is necessary but not sufficient, right? And um, there's a lot of elements to that mindset here. So we do need to continue to look at people who are not patients today, but we also need to be finding and fixing ongoing patient satisfaction issues. We need to be going out there and nurturing the relationships we have with people who have been patients in the past if we expect them to be patients in the future. And then there are opportunities here to map journeys and design experiences to really connect consumers to care that's being delivered from your organization. Now, I think a lot of organizations are looking at what's happening from a loyalty perspective and seeing it from a big risk perspective. I do think that there's another side to that, which is everyone else in the market is having some of those same risks played out as well. So there is, I think, an opportunity right now to recruit patients who in the past we may have thought of as being very attached to other health systems. And so if you have the capacity, and that's a big if in today's market, but if you have the capacity, this is a great time to get aggressive with patient acquisition strategies as well. So later in the flow here, we dug into a couple topics that I've kind of pulled together under the umbrella of personalization and privacy, right? And we wanted to understand, do consumers feel the problem that personalization is meant to fix, right? Do consumers get frustrating if we're not tailoring these digital experiences to them personally? Do they want and expect us to be doing those things? Do they want, personalized experiences? And honestly, I think one of the big concerns from healthcare organizations has been, do they trust us to have this data and use it in this way? And so, we ask those questions pretty directly, right? Is it frustrating when you get stuff that's not relevant to you on the website? And the answer from 2/3 of respondents was yes. It is. It's just, I somewhat agree or strongly agree with the idea that is frustrating, right? So 3/4 of adopters, or sorry, almost three quarters for early adopters, but 2/3 overall. Now, uh, if this frustration is the problem, it would seem like the solution is to create experiences that are more targeted, that are more personalized, that use what we learn about people in order to tailor that experience for what they need. And we see that again across lots of other industries, and I think that the expectation's been set. But what works really well for travel or retail doesn't always translate for healthcare. And of course, there's sort of the just the risk of being creepy and things like that. So we wanted to just get a sense. Hey, like, is this something you expect us to be doing? Do you expect us to be personalizing these digital experiences? And again, the answer here was a pretty resounding yes, right? We had almost 80%, almost 4 out of 5 respondents say, yeah, I agree with the idea that you should be personalizing these digital experiences. Now, these percents didn't correlate that well with age, but they did correlate a lot with technology adoption patterns. And so you see here for the people who are early tech adopters, upwards of 90% said they somewhat agreed or strongly agreed with this idea that we should be personalizing things. For the late tech adopters, it was quite a bit lower. It was, a little over 50% indicating that they somewhat agree or strongly agree. But if, in the situations where they didn't agree, very few people were really in strong disagreement with that position. Most of them were kind of indifferent. They sort of said, well, either way, but we did have large numbers of people who were like, yes, I think this is an expectation for you. And then, of course, I think the concern that a lot of organizations have is we hear a lot from people who are, maybe a little bit over the top with concerns over privacy and things like that. And we obviously should be protecting consumer privacy and protecting this information, but is doing something with this information raise concerns from consumers that we have this data and we're using it in this way? And what we found was 73% of consumers trust that healthcare websites can and will protect this information. It's a large portion of the population. It's not everyone, but it is a very large portion of the population there. And again, we have very few people who are in that strongly disagree category. If they're not in agreement, for the most part, they're kind of indifferent. They don't have a strong feeling either way on this. Interestingly, at least interesting to me, I found young consumers expressed the highest level of concern about this amongst the age groups, the age breakouts, right? So, here almost 60% said yes, but only 60, less than 60% said yes, which was almost as low as our late tech adopters, right? Whereas 57% there said that they trusted this. Our early tech adopters, again, I think, thematically not surprising, overwhelmingly the strongest vote that yes, I trust that you are going to have this information, that you can protect this information and go and do it because I really expect you to be personalizing the experiences based on this information. So what this means to all of us, again, this is, I think, a big green light saying, yes, go create personalized experiences. Consumers want them, they're frustrated when they don't have them, and they do, in fact, trust that you're going to be able to capture the data you need to make it happen and protect that data appropriately. Oh, whoops, wrong direction. Here we go. So our last subject area here was looking at trust in some of the new healthcare entrants in the market. We wanted to see how consumers compare the trust level between their local healthcare system and all these other places that might be delivering care options. And this was an interesting challenge to sort of ask the question, because what's being offered from these different care options out there is all very different. we elected to look at telehealth as kind of our proxy across the board to sort of say, hey, like we're really looking at how much do you trust all these people to deliver care? And the thing that it seemed like everyone could envision each of these players offering was some kind of telehealth. And so that's the way we frame the question. So as the healthcare landscape is becoming more and more crowded, we wanted to look at, the local healthcare system, things that the insurance company might be trying to deliver directly, pharmacies, retail players, other healthcare brands that are reaching out in different ways, tech firms and startups, right? And we felt like this represented much of kind of the new competition in the market. And again, we're testing trust here most of all. Now, the good news is that my local healthcare system won the trust battle here. They came up with the highest ratings, right? And so, the blue bar on the left is yes, I would use that. The green bar is I'd consider it. The kind of goldenrod is I wouldn't use or consider this at all. And so the local healthcare system rated the best overall. I will say though that the benefit there, the advantage there is pretty small over some of the other players that people already have relationships with, right? So my health insurance company, we're just nudging them out there. Pharmacies, just little step down from there. We do have something of a trust advantage, at least again today, above some of the non-traditional players in the market though, right? Retail brands, tech firms, startups, like those are pretty significant steps down from an overall trust perspective. However, as you might expect, this way of viewing the world or this kind of rating is not consistent across the entire audience that we might be talking to out there. So at the outset rather, both seniors and late tech adopters had lower comfort in pretty much across the board. And I think some of this may be coming from the fact that we asked specifically about telehealth, which may be just a thing that they're less comfortable with in general, given what we've heard from these groups elsewhere in the survey. But I do think, they start pretty close up in the left here around my local healthcare system and my health insurance company. Interestingly, both of these groups rated a little bit higher with getting telehealth services from my insurance company than they did from my local healthcare system. Not true in some of the other groups, but definitely true here. I guess it's true for our 18 to 24 group as well. So true for a number of these to be sure here. As we look at our early tech adopters and our young consumers, they had kind of a more balanced interest across the board, right? Their interest in tech firms and startups and things like that, it was certainly a step down from players that they were familiar with, but less so than we saw from some of the other audiences. And again, that 18-24 group is a little bit skeptical of my local health system. And so they actually rated some of those other players, in a pretty similar range there to what they saw from the local healthcare system, where they might not have much of a relationship before, may not have a lot of experience there either. All right, so what do we do with all that? I think it's important to remember that overall we have a trust advantage over a lot of these new players today. Some organizations that I talk to are really feeling the pressure of a lot of these new entrants. They're very concerned about it and the things they bring to the table. Most of them are planning, if not already acting, to try to up their game to make sure that they're relevant and competitive in the future as these new players come in with some very different kinds of offerings. A lot of organizations, though, today are not in that boat, right? And I think it's important to realize that this advantage you've got today doesn't mean that you're safe. It only means that you have time to improve your experience and be more competitive in the future, right? And again, you may have more time if Walmart's not already in your market than if they are already in your market, but they seem pretty committed to the idea that they're going to be in all the markets here eventually, although their time scale for that has certainly slowed down here through the course of the pandemic than it had been in 2019. Likewise, I see a lot of organizations that aren't really feeling the patient departures right now to the extent that there are patients who are peeling off, right? And some of that is that the first patients to go away are maybe younger patients, are maybe less heavy utilizers of the healthcare system. And honestly, a lot of health systems don't have the full capacity that they had before in place today because of staffing challenges and other things. And so, you know, they're not feeling patient departures because the schedules are all still full and they still have long backlogs. Eventually, that's going to sort itself out. So, keep in mind that this is your window right now to make sure that what you're doing from an experience standpoint, from a digital standpoint, from an engagement standpoint, is going to be competitive with all these new different kinds of options that your health consumers are going to have here in the near future if they don't already have them today. And so today really is the best time to start moving down the pathway of investing in upping your digital front door game, building some of the tools that you need, and undergoing some of the initiatives that will get you there. So that's what we've got for today. Oh, Shannon, do you want to talk about what people should expect for next month, and then we'll get into questions?
Yes. So don't miss our next live webinar. In this webinar, you will find out how to increase ROI with a holistic digital approach that aligns with your organization's goals and digital experience. And now we have time for questions, I think, for a few. If you want to leave some in the chat, then I can read them off for Ben. Here's one, Ben. It says,
And actually, while we're doing our Q&A, I'm going to go ahead because we do have kind of a long URL for people to download the full report, but we'll go ahead and we'll put that up for folks who may want to do that as we're talking through the Q&A here.
okay. This question, you say that we should be doing web personalization, but our CMS doesn't really offer that. How do we get started?
Actually, it's a really good question. We have done some other webinars earlier this year talking about personalization, different pathways there, but I think a lot of organizations don't really look at this as a strategy until they get to the point when they're looking to replatform and taking some of the big enterprise DXP platforms, digital experience platforms, on can be a very different level of investment. So there are different ways to get to personalization. And so certainly, taking whatever you have and replacing it with an Optimizely or a Sitecore or something like that is a pathway. And if you've got the resources to do it, is a great way to go. I will say though that for a lot of organizations that aren't looking to replatform, aren't looking to swap out their content management system, there are some great options out there that are kind of personalization layers that sit on top of the content management system that you have today that give you some different options for that. So if you're interested in kind of exploring that and seeing some of the different ways, we do have some folks on staff who are pretty knowledgeable about some of those tool sets. And we put a note in the post webinar survey or reach out to us afterwards. We'd be happy to have a conversation looking at your individual scenario and talking about how we might be able to do some of those things without having to rip everything out and start fresh.
Okay, I have another question. It seems like the interest level in mobile apps was pretty consistent for a lot of the stages of the journey you discussed, but you are saying that's not what we should be doing in our apps. Can you explain that further?
Sure. And I think I can flip back to that slide pretty quickly here. That's I think we're talking about here. And you're right. So the level of interest through self-diagnosis and research and wait times and selecting a doctor, right? It kind of bounces up and down, but a lot of that is within a pretty consistent range in there. And so, if appointment reminders is a good idea, why wouldn't appointment scheduling or ER wait times be a good idea? And the answer is they could be a good idea. However, I wouldn't prioritize doing this, something like ER wait times in a mobile app before I've done it in the website, because the level of interest in getting some of those things from the web is just much, much higher. So start from the places where there's the greatest interest from consumers in doing those things. And then once you've kind of tied that up there, then you can look at, oh, can we also now add it to our app? Can we do some of the things down there? Because there's certainly some people who have an interest in doing it there. It's just a smaller audience. We wouldn't want to not do it in the place where the most consumers are looking for it, because we can do it in a second place that's just less attractive to consumers.
Okay. That is the last question I see. So please remember to download your own copy of the consumer survey. Just remember geonetric.com. You can go there and find it easily. And thank you for joining us. That concludes today's webinar.
Thanks, everybody.